There's a kind of love that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with flowers or speeches or the right words at the right moment. It doesn't sweep in on a white horse or declare itself beneath a window while the rain falls perfectly on cue. It crawls in through the back door, usually at the worst possible time, when both people involved are bleeding from something they haven't yet named. It settles in quietly, like a stranger who sits down across from you at a campfire and doesn't ask permission. And by the time you realize it's there, really there, not the idea of it but the actual weight and heat of it, you've already been changed. I've seen a lot of things in my years riding the Arizona borderlands. I've seen Apache warriors weep over fallen horses. I've seen ranchers laugh at their own funerals, more or less. I've seen droughts that lasted long enough to make a man question whether God remembered this particular stretch of earth. But I've never seen anything quite like what happened between Caleb Dunmore and Sonia of the Chaconin Chiricahua, and I've been trying to write it down correctly for 11 years now. The problem isn't remembering. The problem is that every time I start from the beginning, I realize the beginning wasn't where I thought it was. So let me start with the scream, because that's where most people would start and most people wouldn't be entirely wrong. She screamed it so loud that 3 horses on the far side of the canyon shifted and stamped. Her voice cracked on the second word, never, like the word itself couldn't hold the weight she was putting on it. And Caleb just stood there in the dust, hat in his hand, looking at her the way a man looks at a thunderstorm he knew was coming but hoped would pass him by. He smiled, not the smile of someone who wasn't listening, not the smile of someone who thought he'd already won. It was the smile of someone who had decided, quietly and completely, that the outcome didn't change the commitment. "Then I'll spend my life waiting for you," he said. She turned and walked away without looking back. He watched her until she disappeared into the cedar shadow. Then he put his hat back on, and he went back to work. That, as best I can reconstruct it, is where this story truly begins. Not with attraction or fate or whatever word you want to use, but with one man deciding that love was not a negotiation, and one woman deciding that it absolutely was, and both of them being right in ways neither of them understood yet. I'm going to try to tell it properly this time. My name is Arlo Maves, and I keep a logbook. I've kept one since I was 17 and got lost for 6 days in the Dragoon Mountains with nothing but a half-dead mule and a pocket Bible whose pages I eventually had to burn for warmth. A man alone with his thoughts for 6 days learns real fast that thoughts need somewhere to go, or they turn inward and start eating you from the center out. So I started writing. Date, location, weather, what I saw, what I felt, what I didn't understand. That last category has always been the longest. By the time I met Caleb Dunmore in the autumn of 1883, I'd filled 14 logbooks. I was 31 years old, working as a trail surveyor for a land management company that was mostly trying to figure out where Apache land ended and territorial land began. A question that, depending on who you asked, had about 40 different answers, none of them comfortable. Caleb was 26. He ran a remuda operation out of a small spread in the Sulphur Springs Valley, which meant he bred and traded horses, and he did it well enough that both Apache traders and Anglo ranchers sought him out, which was not a common position to occupy in 1883. Most men were one or the other. Caleb had somehow made himself useful to both, which is different from being trusted by both, a distinction he understood better than most. He was not a large man, medium height, lean in the way that comes from not enough meals rather than deliberate discipline, with hands that were 2 sizes too big for his frame. The kind of hands that belonged to someone who started working before the rest of him was finished growing. He had a habit of turning his hat brim in his fingers when he was nervous, which was more often than he'd ever admit. And he had a scar along his left jawline that he always said came from a fence post, and that nobody ever fully believed. I met him at a trading post near the San Bernardino River on a Thursday morning in October. I'd stopped to water my horse and refill my canteen, and he was sitting on a barrel outside the main building, talking to a man I later learned was a Chaconin trader named Huso Rojo, Red Bone, who moved between the Apache camps and the border settlements with a kind of diplomatic immunity that had been earned through decades of carefully maintained neutrality. The conversation was in a mix of Spanish and Chiricahua Apache that Caleb followed with visible concentration, leaning slightly forward, nodding when he understood, asking for repetition when he didn't, not embarrassed about it, just practical. That caught my attention. Most Anglo men in that situation either pretended they understood or walked away. Caleb just kept working at it. I introduced myself. He said his name, shook my hand, and went back to his conversation. I sat down with my canteen and my logbook and I wrote, October 12, San Bernardino Crossing, met horse trader approx. 2526 name Dunmore, speaks some Chiricahua, doesn't show off about it, probably worth talking to. That's the professional assessment. What I didn't write, because I couldn't quite articulate it yet, was that there was something in Caleb Dunmore's posture that struck me as different. He was at ease in a situation that made most men tighten up, not because he was careless about the tensions around him, but because he seemed to have made some internal peace with uncertainty, like a man who'd stopped expecting the world to be simpler than it was. 3 days later, I rode into the Chaconin camp with him. That was my first introduction to Sunya. The camp was positioned in a wide, shallow canyon about 8 miles northeast of the trading post. Not a permanent settlement, but a wintering spot they'd used for years, familiar enough to feel like home, temporary enough to leave without ceremony when the time came. There were maybe 40 people, several large wickiups, and a herd of horses that, even by my surveyor's eye, were exceptional. Caleb's business was with a headman named Tsachai, Iron Foot, roughly, who oversaw horse breeding for this band. They had a standing arrangement. Caleb provided certain grains and medicinal supplies. Tsachai provided young horses for Caleb to train and trade into Anglo markets. It was the kind of arrangement that shouldn't have worked in 1883 and probably wouldn't have survived another year without someone blowing it up. But it worked that autumn, and both men took it seriously. I was there as a surveyor doing background observation. Tsachai allowed it because Caleb vouched for me, and because he'd dealt with enough surveyors to know that the ones who came honestly up front were marginally less dangerous than the ones who didn't. I hung back near the horses. I always feel more comfortable near horses. They don't judge, and they give you something to look at when you need to seem occupied. That's when Sunya walked past me with a water jar balanced on her shoulder, and the complete, unhurried confidence of someone who had never once worried about what a stranger might think of her. She was, I need to be careful here because this is not my love story, and I don't want to write it like it is. She was 22, I learned later, though she carried herself older. Dark-haired, strong through the shoulders, with eyes that the word assessing doesn't quite cover. They were the eyes of someone who classified things rapidly and completely and rarely revised the classification. She had a small scar at her left temple, origin unknown. She wore a copper bracelet on her right wrist that I later learned had been her mother's. She did not look at me when she walked past. She looked at Caleb, and the look she gave him was not warm and it was not hostile. It was something in between, measured, waiting, like she had an open question about him that she was still deciding whether to ask. Caleb, for his part, turned from his conversation with Tsachai and said something to her in Chiricahua. My vocabulary in that language at that point extended to about 12 words, of which 6 were directions and 2 were food items. But whatever he said, it made her stop walking. She responded without looking at him directly, addressing the air to his left, which I later understood was a specific cultural register. Not dismissal, but a refusal to grant full engagement. He said something else. She replied, sharper this time. He didn't push back. He just nodded and went back to Tsachai. She walked on. I wrote in my logbook, Dunmore knows at least one woman in camp who doesn't like him. Or maybe she does, hard to say which, something unfinished there. I had no idea. Over the next 2 weeks, I spent 6 days in or near that camp, taking measurements, making notes, trying to understand the terrain. Caleb was there for 3 of those days, and I fell into the habit of spending evenings with him because he was the only person who would talk to me freely, and because he made decent coffee, which in the Arizona territory of 1883 was a non-trivial quality. He talked about horses mostly. Breeding lines, temperament, what the Chaconin trainers did differently from Anglo trainers, and they did do things differently, he explained, not in ways that were better or worse, but in ways that came from entirely different understandings of what a horse was and what a human relationship with a horse meant. The Chaconin didn't break a horse in the sense that most Anglo ranchers meant. They didn't establish dominance through pressure and surrender. They worked through patience and repetition and a kind of gradual negotiation, the horse coming to accept the human not because it had no other option, but because it had over time decided it could. Takes longer, Caleb said one night, turning a stick in the fire. First time I saw it, I thought I thought they were being slow. Then I watched what the horse was like afterward. Nothing like a broke horse, nothing like it. How so? I asked. He thought about it. A broke horse does what you ask because it's learned not to fight. This horse, it did what you asked because it had decided you were worth listening to. He paused. I'd never seen that before. I wrote it down. Then I looked up and said, "Is that how you think about most things? Finding out whether something or someone is worth listening to?" He didn't answer right away, turned his hat brim in his fingers. Then, "I think most things decide on their own schedule," he said. "Doesn't do much good to rush it." I thought about that for a while, and then I thought about the way Sonia had looked at him that first afternoon, that open, waiting question in her face, and I thought I was beginning to understand something. Not everything, just a corner of it. The situation I hadn't understood, which I gradually pieced together over those 2 weeks through overheard conversations, careful observation, and Caleb's careful non-explanations, was this. Sacha had a nephew named Nake who was 24 years old, skilled, well-regarded, and had expressed formal interest in Sonia, who was Sacha's niece through a different line, which made the arrangement complicated in ways I won't pretend to fully understand, but which Sacha seemed to consider navigable. Nake was a good man by every account I encountered. Steady, reliable, respected. He was also, by every account that mattered to Sonia, someone she respected but did not love and did not want. This was not, in the Chakonin context of 1883, an especially simple position to occupy. Sonia had autonomy. Chiricahua Apache women had considerably more agency in these matters than most Anglo women of the same era, which was something I found striking when I understood it. But autonomy is not the same as freedom from family expectation, and Sacha was not a man who made suggestions lightly. Sonia had been deflecting the situation for almost a year. What she had not anticipated, and what had complicated everything considerably, was Caleb Dunmore riding in twice a month with horse grain and medical supplies, and a stubborn willingness to learn 12 new words of Chiricahua every time, and the question his existence had started to create in her chest. I say it that way because that's how she described it years later when she finally told the story. A question in my chest, not a feeling, not yet. A question, whether something was worth it, whether someone was worth the particular kind of complicated that crossing that particular distance would mean. She didn't know he felt anything. He hadn't said it. He was careful, carefully careful, the way you are when you know that the slightest misstep will collapse the whole structure, and the structure matters to you for reasons beyond just the feeling. She had noticed him noticing her. She had noticed the noticing was different from the way other Anglo men looked at Apache women, which ranged from invisible to predatory with very little in between. His noticing was attentive, respectful, and most confusingly patient. He didn't push toward anything. He just kept showing up, kept doing his work, kept being useful to people she cared about, kept finding one more word to add to his vocabulary. It drove her slightly crazy, in the way that patience always drives crazy the person who is trying to resist it. The morning everything shifted, or rather, the morning everything that had been shifting underground finally broke the surface, was a Tuesday in late October, 5 days before I was due to leave the area. I was at the edge of the horse pen, making sketch measurements of the canyon wall, when I heard raised voices from inside one of the larger wickiups. Not unusual in itself, people argue everywhere. But the voices resolved into recognizable shapes fast enough that I found myself going very still and very interested, which I'm not particularly proud of. One voice was Sacha's, which I recognized by its register, deep, measured even when raised, the voice of a man accustomed to being the heaviest presence in any room. One voice was Sonia's, and even though I couldn't understand the words, I could hear in her voice what anyone can hear in any language. The specific frequency of someone who is being pressed to agree to something they don't want to agree to, and who has been holding the refusal carefully for a long time, and who can feel the careful hold starting to crack. I don't know exactly what Sacha said. I never asked, and she never told that part specifically, but I know what it was about. Caleb was 20 feet away, working with one of the young horses, a 3-year-old roan that was still deciding about people, and I could see from the set of his shoulders that he could hear it too. He kept his eyes on the horse. He kept his hands steady. But the hat brim turning had started, and his fingers were working the leather with a speed that told me he was not as calm as he was presenting. The voices stopped. Then the wiki-up entrance opened and Sonia walked out. She walked straight toward Caleb. Not at me, not toward the water, not in any of the directions a person walks when they're walking away from something. She walked toward him with the specific, purposeful stride of someone who has made a decision in the last 30 seconds and is going to act on it before the decision unmakes itself. Caleb heard her coming and turned. I put down my pencil. What happened next took about 90 seconds, and I'm going to try to write it as accurately as I can, understanding that I could only hear some of it and reconstruct the rest later. She said something to him in Chiricahua first. Short. He answered also short, also in Chiricahua, which surprised her. I could see that. The surprise shifted something in her face, opened it slightly, and then she caught the opening and closed it back up. Then she switched to Spanish, which was the language they'd been building between them over months of small transactions, not fluent for either, but workable. She said, and I caught this much clearly, that she needed him to understand something, that whatever he thought was happening between them wasn't. That she had enough complications in her life without adding the particular complication he represented. That she had a future that was already mapped, and she intended to walk it without detours. He listened, hat brim in his fingers. Then he said something quiet that I couldn't hear from where I was standing. Whatever it was the wrong thing, or the right thing at the wrong time, or maybe just too honest. Because Sonia's face went through something fast and complicated, and then she stepped back, and then she said it, loud, clear, loud enough for the horses to hear it, and probably for Tsacha inside the wiki-up to hear it. I'll never marry you. The canyon held it for a second. The roan horse shifted. Someone's fire crackled. Caleb stood there with his hat in his hands, and then, slowly, like something warming rather than breaking, he smiled. Not a challenge, not amusement, something quieter than both. And he said, "Then I'll spend my life waiting for you." She stared at him. I don't think she'd expected that. I think she'd expected an argument, or a withdrawal, or the particular kind of masculine wounded pride that turns quickly into contempt. She'd built the resistance for a specific kind of pushback, and he'd given her something completely different, and she had no structure to put it in. She looked at him for 4 seconds. I counted. Then she turned and walked away. He watched her until she was gone. Then he turned back to the roan horse, put a hand on its neck, and stood there for a moment not doing anything, just breathing, just being still. The roan horse, for the record, leaned into his hand. I wrote in my logbook, October 24. Dunmore just did something either very brave or very foolish. I don't yet know which. Maybe both. The woman is going to have to decide. He's already decided. That's the whole situation right there. I thought that was the end of the acute crisis, the way fires sometimes seem to go out before the wind shifts. I had no idea. The real fire hadn't started yet. What I understood about Sonia in those first 2 weeks was limited by language, and by the usual barrier of being an outsider who is trying to observe carefully without intrusion. But I'd learned enough to know this. She was not a simple person making a simple refusal. She was a woman standing at the intersection of 3 different logics that all had valid claim on her life. The first logic was her family's, Tsacha's careful pragmatism, his reading of the political situation, his understanding that alliances mattered more as pressure on Apache land increased, and his belief that a well-matched internal marriage was one of the few stable things left in a destabilizing world. She didn't dismiss this. She understood it. She even, in certain moods, agreed with it. The second logic was her own culture's, the Chiricahua Apache framework in which women had real agency, real property, real decision-making weight, and in which a woman's refusal was not automatically overridable, but in which that same framework was built on collective survival rather than individual fulfillment, which created its own kind of gravity. The third logic was something she didn't have clean language for. It was the logic of the question in her chest. The question that Caleb Dunmore, by existing calmly and usefully and patiently at the edges of her life, had put there without even seeming to try. She was furious about the third logic, genuinely, specifically furious, not at him exactly, but at the situation he represented, at the complication. At the fact that something she hadn't invited had come in through a back door, she'd been too careless to guard. She was also, beneath the fury, afraid, not of him, of what wanting something outside the first two logics would cost. I didn't know all of that yet. I learned it in pieces over years. What I knew that evening, sitting by my small fire with my logbook, was that something real had happened in that canyon. Not just between two people, but between two entirely different understandings of what patience meant, and what waiting meant, and what a promise meant when it was made without any expectation of being collected. I wrote for a long time that night, more than any other night in my 14 logbooks. At the bottom of the page I wrote, he said he'd wait. I think he meant it. I think she knows he meant it. I think that's the part that frightens her most. Then I went to sleep with the sound of the canyon wind and the horses shifting in the darkness, and I dreamed about water running toward something it couldn't see yet. The last thing that happened in part one of this story, though I didn't know it was a part of anything then, just a day, came the following morning. I was breaking down my campsite at first light, preparing to ride south for my next survey position. Caleb was still there, staying one more day to finalize the details of his trade arrangement with Satch. I found him at the horse pen at dawn, working with the roan again. The horse had come considerably further overnight, was accepting the halter without drama, standing quietly while Caleb ran his hands down its neck and flanks. Patient work, slow work, the kind of work that looks like nothing is happening until suddenly everything has happened. I stood at the fence and watched for a few minutes. "You really meant it," I said finally. "Yesterday." He didn't look up from the horse. "Yep. That's a hell of a promise to make to someone who just told you no." "Wasn't a promise to her," he said. "Was a statement of fact, what I'm going to do regardless." I thought about that. What if she never? "Then I'll have spent my life being honest about something real," he said. "Worse ways to spend it." The roan horse turned and pressed its nose against Caleb's chest. He stood there and let it. I picked up my saddlebag. "You know this is going to get harder before it gets simpler," I said. "Most true things do," he said. I rode out as the sun came up over the canyon wall. Behind me, I could hear the horse moving, the soft sound of its hooves on the dry ground, the quiet of a man who decided something and was now simply living inside that decision. I added one more line to my logbook before the light got too bright to write by. The horse trusts him. She might eventually. Neither is a sure thing, but he's not asking for a sure thing. He's just asking for time. Whether time is something either of them has that, I don't know yet. 11 months passed before I came back. In that time, 3 things happened to the Arizona territory that are relevant to this story. The first is that the pressure on Apache land intensified in ways that made the arrangement between Satch and Caleb increasingly precarious. Not because either man wanted it to fail, but because the forces arranging themselves around them cared nothing about individual arrangements. The second is that Nake, Satchai's nephew, married someone else. A woman from a neighboring band, a good match, a good marriage. Sunya had nothing to do with it. He had made his own peace with her continued refusal and found someone who wanted to be found. This changed the internal geometry of the camp in ways I'd only understand later. The third is that Caleb Dunmore, by every account I could gather when I returned in September of 1884, had continued showing up. Twice a month, as agreed. Horse grain, medical supplies, the new vocabulary words, he didn't push. He didn't adjust his behavior to create more contact with Sunya than the work naturally produced. He just continued, being useful, being consistent, being in a situation where everything else was increasingly inconsistent, the one thing that didn't change. I heard this from Huso Rojo, the trader, who had his finger in more contexts than most people knew and who seemed genuinely amused by the situation. The Chaconan say he has the patience of a stone, Huso Rojo told me over a meal at the San Bernardino trading post. He said it in Spanish, with a particular inflection that made it sound like both a compliment and a warning. "Is that what they call it?" I asked. He made a gesture with his hand, something between a shrug and a nod. "Sunya calls it something else." "What does she call it?" He smiled. "She says he has the patience of a man who is wrong about himself." I wrote that down immediately. What does she mean by that? "She means," Huso Rojo said, "that he thinks he is patient, but she thinks he is just afraid to want things directly, that what he calls waiting is what she calls not knowing how to ask." I sat with that for a while. Is she right? I think, Huso Rojo said carefully, that they are both right about each other in ways that will either ruin this or save it, and that neither of them knows enough yet to know which. When I arrived at the Chaconin camp that September, the atmosphere was different. The easy equilibrium of the previous autumn had tightened. There were fewer people. Some families had moved further south, deeper into Mexico, following one of the several fractures in the Chiricahua situation that were happening in those years with increasing frequency. Satchai was still there, still headman, but the weight he was carrying was visible in his face in a way it hadn't been a year before. Caleb was there when I arrived. He acknowledged me with a nod and kept working. Sonia was there. She acknowledged me with a slightly longer look than the previous year, the look of someone who has been told about you, though in what terms you're not sure. The dynamic between her and Caleb had shifted. Not resolved, nothing as simple as that, but shifted. The open question I'd seen in her face the previous year had changed character. It was less waiting and more active, like she'd been thinking about the question in her own chest for 11 months and had arrived at some conclusions, or near conclusions, or conclusions in progress, and was now watching him with those conclusions running in the background. He didn't seem to know this, or if he did, he was containing the knowledge so carefully it was functionally the same as not knowing. The thing that happened first, before the larger things, before the things that mattered most, was small, and I almost missed it. It was the second evening of my visit. I was sitting at the edge of the camp with my logbook, the usual position. A child, maybe 7, 8 years old, Satchai's granddaughter, had gotten her foot caught in some rope near the horse pen and was sitting in the dirt crying while the rope tangled further the more she struggled. Caleb was the first adult to reach her. He crouched down, not in a hurry, speaking quietly. I heard the Chiricahua cadence even if I couldn't catch the words, and the child looked at him with the deep suspicion children reserve for unfamiliar men. And then the suspicion gradually resolved as he worked the rope free slowly, carefully, talking the whole time. When the rope came free, the child sat for a moment, then said something to him, and he responded, and she laughed, actually laughed, a bright, clean sound, and ran off. Caleb stood, dusted his knees off, and turned back toward the horses. Sonia was standing 10 feet away. She'd come out of the wickiup behind me, and I'd heard her stop, heard the pause in her footsteps when he'd crouched down by the child. Now she stood watching him walk back toward the horses, and the thing in her face was something I hadn't seen there before. It wasn't the measured question. It wasn't the careful resistance. It was something more unguarded than either, something that had snuck up through the careful maintenance and appeared on her face before she could stop it. She caught me looking. Her expression closed immediately, became neutral. I looked back at my logbook and didn't write anything for almost 10 minutes. I was trying to give her the privacy of the moment, even in retrospect. When I finally wrote something, it was, she's losing the argument with herself. She might not know it yet, but she is. The real crisis arrived 4 days later, and it came from a direction none of us were watching. 3 men from a land assessment operation arrived at the camp's edge with papers and a surveyor's chain. Not my kind of survey, not the background observation kind, but the kind with legal authority and specific intent. I knew the company they worked for. I knew what those papers usually meant. I won't go into the full details of the legal mechanism here because it would take longer than the story can hold. The short version is, there was a question about the legitimacy of the Chaconin Band's use of this particular canyon as a winter camp, whether it fell under existing reservation boundaries or outside them, and the 3 men with papers believed they had authority to begin assessment and potential reallocation of the land. They were wrong about the authority. But being wrong about authority in 1884, Arizona didn't protect you from the consequences of being overruled, because the overruling took time, and time was exactly what these men were banking on. Satchai received them with the kind of controlled stillness I'd come to associate with men who have survived by being smarter than the situation wanted them to be. He spoke with them for 20 minutes in Spanish, while several of the camp's men stood at careful positions around the perimeter. Not threatening, just present. The specific presence of people who are tracking every word. Caleb was there. Satch had asked him to stay, which I understood. Caleb was a known Anglo figure in the area, a man with documented trading relationships and letters from a Tucson attorney attesting to his business legitimacy. His visible presence during the conversation changed the optics slightly, made it harder for the 3 men to claim later that there'd been no witnesses who could testify in Anglo courts. It was a legal and political calculation, and Sache made it in seconds. I was impressed. The three men were not impressed. The eldest of them, a red-faced man named Greer, whom I recognized from a previous professional crossing, looked at Caleb with the specific contempt reserved for Anglos who were perceived as having chosen the wrong side. "You know these people?" Greer asked him. "I do business here," Caleb said. "That your horse operation?" "Part of it." Greer looked at the papers in his hands, then back at Caleb. "This land might be coming under assessment. You'd want to know that." "I'll take note," Caleb said in a tone that meant the opposite. Greer said a few more things designed to make the situation feel more resolved than it was. Then the three men left. Sache watched them go. Then he spoke to the men around the perimeter, a short sentence, calm, and they dispersed. Then he turned to Caleb and had a longer conversation that I caught most of. The essence: this was not going away. The papers were bad paperwork, but they were the first papers, and bad first papers were always followed by more papers. The question was what to do now, before the paperwork became something harder to argue with. Caleb said he had a contact, the Tucson attorney, plus another man who dealt with exactly this kind of assessment challenge. He could send letters that week. Sache said that would help, but that the band needed to decide about the winter camp site. There was another position, 3 Canyons East, less ideal but defensible in different ways. The conversation continued, careful and specific. I sat at the edge and took notes and was aware, in the background of my attention, that Sonia had come out of one of the wiki-ups during the confrontation with Greer and was now standing near the horse pen, watching. Not watching the retreating men, watching Caleb. That night there was a fire and something that became a quiet gathering, not a ceremony, just people sitting together in the way that people sit together after something frightening has happened and been survived, at least for the moment. Children were eventually taken to sleep. The fire got smaller. The circle got tighter. I sat slightly outside it, which was where I belonged. Caleb sat at the edge of it, which was also, I realized, where he always put himself, useful distance, present but not presumptuous. Sonia brought water to where he was sitting. This was not, I had learned over 2 visits, an unconscious gesture. It was specific, intentional, a quiet language that didn't need translation for anyone watching carefully. Caleb looked up, said something quiet. She sat down. Not next to him, at a right angle, the way you sit when you're not arriving but you're also not leaving. She said something. He answered. They talked for, I don't know exactly, maybe 40 minutes. Quietly, in the mix of Spanish and Chiricahua they'd been building between them for over a year, with gaps where neither had the word, and one of them had to gesture or try something in the other language, or occasionally, just let the idea stay incomplete between them, which is its own form of intimacy. I didn't try to hear it, it wasn't mine. What I did hear near the end, because her voice rose slightly, not with anger this time, but with something else. She said in Spanish, "Why didn't you leave when I told you to leave?" A pause. He said, also in Spanish, "I wasn't here for what you told me to leave." She was quiet for a moment. He said something else, quieter, that I didn't catch. Then she said, very quietly but clearly, the question I'd been watching her try not to ask for 11 months. "What are you here for?" And he said, without pausing, without turning his hat brim, without any of the nervous tells I'd learned to watch for, "You already know." The fire crackled. She looked at the fire. He looked at the fire. They sat like that for a while, in a silence that was completely different from the silences they'd been keeping before. Then she stood and went inside, and he sat there another hour by himself, not turning his hat brim, just sitting with his hands still in his lap. I wrote nothing that night. I closed my logbook and sat with the sound of the wind and the dying fire, and let the moment be what it was. 3 days later, I was preparing to leave again. Caleb was staying another week. The legal letters needed drafting, and he decided to write them on site rather than riding south and returning. I found Sonia at the water source one morning early before anyone else was up. I didn't intend to talk to her. I was filling my canteen. She spoke first in Spanish. "You write everything down." It wasn't quite a question. "Habit," I said. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the water. "Do you write him down?" I thought about being careful with the answer, decided against it. Yes. What do you write? That he's one of the most patient people I've ever encountered, I said. And that patience, that real, either comes from strength or from fear, and I'm still deciding which. She considered this. Those aren't opposites, she said finally. I blinked, thought about it. No, I said, they're not. She looked at me directly, the full classification look, nothing held back. He told you he would wait. He did. He told Sacha the same eventually, not to ask permission, just as a fact. She paused. He's peculiar. He is, I agreed. I don't know what to do with him, she said. It was the most unguarded thing she'd said to me, and I had the feeling she'd said it exactly because it was still early and no one else was listening, and the water was running, and it needed to be said out loud to someone before it could be handled. I know, I said. He's going to keep coming back. Yes. She was quiet for a long moment. The land, she said. What happens if Greer's people come back with more papers? I don't know, I said honestly. Caleb's letters might help, might not be enough. She nodded slowly, as if I'd confirmed something she'd already calculated. Then she said something in Chiricahua, quietly, to herself more than to me, and picked up her water jar and walked back toward the camp. I stood by the water for a moment. Then I opened my logbook and wrote, She's not deciding whether to want him. She's decided that already or nearly. She's deciding whether the wanting is survivable. Whether what he represents, not him, not the person, but the full weight of what crossing that particular distance would mean, is something she can carry and still be herself. That's not a small question. It might be the largest question there is. I don't know if she'll answer it yes. I don't know if Caleb knows that's the question she's actually working on. I'm not sure either of them can afford to know yet. I put the logbook away and rode south. Behind me, the canyon was waking up. I could hear the horses, and somewhere further in, the sound of someone building a fire, the careful, specific sound of someone making something last. The third time I came back was not planned. It was February of 1885, midwinter, and I came back because Huso Rojo had sent me a message. A man carried it to my survey camp near Bisbee, 3 pages of careful Spanish in Huso Rojo's cramped handwriting, telling me that the situation at the Chaconin Canyon camp had reached a point, and that if I wanted to see how this particular story ended or continued or changed, now was the time to ride. He didn't explain further. Huso Rojo rarely explained. He offered information the way some men offer food, present it, let you decide, don't ask questions about your appetite. I rode 3 days in cold that got down below freezing at night, and I arrived at the canyon camp on a Thursday morning in early February with frost on my jacket and a horse that had decided opinions about the whole enterprise. The camp was quieter than either of my previous visits. Smaller, several more families had relocated over the winter. But it was still there, still functioning, still Tsachai's camp with its particular dignity and its exceptional horses, and its ongoing resistance to the paperwork reality that kept arriving from the south. Caleb's legal letters had helped. Not completely, nothing was complete in that period, but enough. The assessment had been delayed, contested, pushed into channels where it would take years rather than months to resolve. He'd ridden to Tucson twice during the winter to meet with the attorney personally. He'd written to a congressman he'd done horse business with, which was a long shot that had surprised everyone by producing a response. Sacha had accepted all of this help without making it into something it wasn't. He thanked Caleb, discussed strategy with him as an equal, and kept his own counsel about what it meant in the larger picture. It was, I thought, the most honest kind of gratitude, the kind that doesn't diminish the giver by overpraising them. I arrived to find Caleb at the horse pen, as usual, and Sonia at the fire near Tsachai's wickiup, which was also her usual position. What was not usual was that when Caleb saw me arrive, his face did something brief and complicated before resettling. Not surprise exactly, more like the expression of a man who knows a witness has arrived at an important moment and is uncertain whether that's good. I tied my horse and went to find a place to sit and get warm. Huso Rojo arrived the following morning. He'd ridden from the trading post, and he brought news that changed the shape of the next week entirely. The contested assessment question had been complicated further by a development in the territorial capital, a development I won't detail here beyond saying that it meant the legal situation had become temporarily more rather than less volatile, and that Sachai's band had a decision to make about the winter camp sooner than they'd expected. Sachai called a gathering, not a ceremony, a council. Practical, specific, attended by the adults of the camp, lasting most of a morning. I sat outside with my logbook and didn't pretend I understood what was happening in there. I knew the shape of it. A community making a hard decision about land and survival and what to hold and what to release, which is a shape that has no comfortable answer and no version that doesn't cost something. Caleb sat near me. He'd been invited to the council, Sachai had asked him, and he'd declined on the grounds that this was not his decision to influence. He'd said what he knew about the legal situation, offered what help he could continue to provide, and then stepped back. This was, I thought, one of the most genuinely correct things I'd seen him do, not because he was following a rule. Because he understood what the rule was for. "What do you think they'll decide?" I asked him. "To stay," he said immediately, then after a pause, "maybe." "Both answers." "It's both situations," he said. "Stay in the camp but be ready to move, hold the ground but don't be held by it." He turned his hat brim. "That's not my decision, though." "What is your decision?" I asked. He looked at me sideways. "You know what my decision is." "I know what it was 18 months ago," I said. "I want to know if it's the same." He was quiet for a moment. The cold air moved through the canyon. A horse stamped. "Same," he said. The council ended around midday. Sachai came out and spoke with Caleb for half an hour, specific, practical conversation about what the winter and spring would look like, what resources were needed, what the next legal steps were. Caleb listened and answered and made notes on a small paper he kept in his vest pocket, which I'd noticed before. He kept notes the way I kept logbooks in miniature for the same reason. Things needed somewhere to go. After Sachai went inside, Caleb sat for a while. Then Sonia came out. She walked toward where he was sitting with the same purposeful stride as 18 months earlier, but different. The decision in it was different, not hot and reactive, but settled and considered. The stride of someone who had been deciding for a long time and had finished. She sat down beside him. Actually beside him, not at an angle, not maintaining the careful diplomatic distance. Beside him, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching in the cold. He went very still. She said something in Chiricahua. He answered in kind, and for a moment they spoke only in that language, her language. And whatever they said I couldn't follow, but the texture of the conversation was nothing like anything I'd heard between them before. It was low and even, the rhythm of two people who are not fighting anymore. Then she switched to Spanish. She said, and I heard this clearly, "You said you would wait." "Yes," he said. "Did you know what you were waiting for?" He thought about it. I knew what I hoped. I didn't know if the hope was worth anything. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My uncle believes it is worth something. Nake, you know, he married. He thinks it was the right thing. He is not unhappy." She paused. "I have been trying to use other people's rightness to understand my own situation. It doesn't work." "No," Caleb said softly, "it doesn't." "My mother's bracelet," she said, and touched the copper at her wrist. "She gave it to me when I was 8. She said it means that you are held by something that will outlast you, that you belong to something larger than the moment you are in." She looked at it. I used to think she meant the band, the people. Maybe she did. Caleb didn't answer. He was giving her the space to finish. She looked at him directly. "The question I have had in here," she touched her chest, exactly the gesture I'd imagined when Huso Rojo had told me her word for it. "The question is whether the thing that holds you is chosen or found." "And," he said. "I think," she said slowly, "that it is both, that you find something and then you choose whether to hold it back." The cold air sat between them. He said very quietly, "And have you decided?" She looked at him for a long time, not with the measuring assessment look, with something much more open than that, something that had the specific vulnerability of a person who has decided and is letting the deciding be seen, which is the most exposed moment there is. "I decided in the summer," she said. "I have been deciding how to say it since then." He breathed out slowly. She said, "The thing you said, that you would spend your life waiting. I thought you were performing something dramatic that men do when they want things." "I know," he said. "I watched you for 18 months, she said. "You didn't perform, she searched for the word. "You just remained." It's all I knew how to do, he said honestly. She almost smiled. It was enough, she said. It was more than enough. I'm not going to describe what happened next in detail, because it doesn't belong to me and it never did. What I can say is that they sat together for a long time in the cold, and that the quality of the silence was entirely different from every silence I'd watched them keep before. Not distance, not careful management. The silence of two people who have arrived, finally, at the same place at the same time. I wrote in my logbook, February 9, 1885. They've arrived, both of them. Whatever this is, whatever it will be, it has arrived today. Then I went to tend to my horse and gave the canyon its privacy. The complications that followed were real and were many, and I won't pretend otherwise. 1885 was not a year in which the Arizona Territory made things easy for anyone trying to live outside the lines that had been drawn for them. And Caleb Dunmore and Sonia of the Chaconin Chiricahua were living outside nearly every line simultaneously. The cultural negotiation alone was extensive. Satchai's acceptance was not automatic. It was earned over months through Caleb's continued practical contribution to the band's survival, through formal conversations conducted with exactly the patience and care that had characterized everything Caleb did, and through Sonia's own advocacy, which was fierce and specific and left Satchai in no doubt about where she stood. The outside world had its own opinions, none of which were asked for and most of which were hostile in some direction or another. Anglo neighbors who'd respected Caleb's horse business found the situation difficult. Apache community members who'd been skeptical of Caleb from the beginning had points in their favor. The legal situation with the land ground on, slowly, expensively, with setbacks and small victories, and Caleb's involvement in it made him both more valued and more conspicuous. None of it was easy. I want to be clear about that because stories like this have a way of softening in the retelling, and I've already softened it more than I intended. The cost was real. The friction was real. What was also real? Caleb Dunmore, who had said he would spend his life waiting, discovered that the waiting had ended and been replaced by something harder and better than waiting. Something that required everything he'd developed in those 18 months of patience, and then more flexibility, humility, the willingness to be wrong and say so, the willingness to let someone else be the authority in a situation where he was not. He was not always good at these things. He was not always even adequate. He had days when the strangeness of his position overwhelmed him, and he made errors, pushed when he should have waited, withdrew when he should have spoken. Sonia's own nature, which included a sharpness and a directness that she'd always possessed, but that he was now encountering at full strength rather than managed distance, surprised him regularly. But he never, in the years I watched them, reverted to the thing that had made her scream that day in the canyon. He never assumed that what he wanted was the same thing as what was right. He held that awareness carefully, the way you hold something you know you could break. And she, for her part, held the question she'd answered with equal seriousness. It would have been possible, I've seen it happen, for the long decision to become resentment in the wrong conditions. For the complication of what she'd chosen to become something she blamed on the chooser. She chose against that, regularly and deliberately, in ways that I saw but don't need to transcribe because they were private. They were a strange fit and a real one. Those two things held simultaneously for years. The last time I visited, truly visited, not passing through on a survey, was the autumn of 1888. Caleb had a small operation running near the canyon now, with Satchai's agreement and on terms that had been carefully negotiated and were revisited every year. The legal situation with the land had stabilized into a kind of exhausted standoff that was better than what it had been, even if it was not good. They had a son. He was 2 years old, dark-haired and long-limbed, and he moved through the camp with the specific confidence of a child who knows exactly which people are his. He had Sonia's eyes and Caleb's oversized hands, which on a 2-year-old produced a slightly comic effect that neither parent seemed immune to. I sat with Caleb one evening after the boy was asleep. "You're writing about us," Caleb said. It was not a question. "I've been writing about everything," I said. "But specifically us." "You're specifically interesting," I said. He half smiled. "She knows." "What does she think?" "She says a person's life isn't a story until someone else needs it to be. Until then it's just," he gestured vaguely, "living." I sat with that for a while. "Is that what you think?" He turned his hat brim slower than he used to, I noticed, less anxious. "I think she's right most of the time," he said. "It's a useful habit." The fire burned. "You said something to her," I said. "That morning in the canyon, before she said she'd never marry you, something quiet. I've always wondered what it was." He looked at the fire for a long moment. Then he said, "I told her that I wasn't asking for her to want what I wanted. I was asking for her to let me stay in the same world as her while I figured out how to be worth wanting." I stared at him. He shrugged, almost embarrassed. "It came out better in Spanish." "That," I said, "is the least believable thing you've ever told me." He laughed, actually laughed, low and genuine, and the sound went up into the canyon and scattered. I wrote it down, all of it, then I wrote below it. He asked for time. She gave it eventually, and the giving was not defeat but decision. The hardest kind of decision, the kind that can't be justified in advance, only lived into. And he who said he would wait discovered that what waiting had actually been was preparation. Not for her to arrive at him, for him to become something worth arriving at. I don't know if that's what he knew he was doing. I don't think he did. But the roan horse knew. The Chaconan horses knew from the beginning. That some people come toward you not to take something, but to become something. That some patience is not endurance, but growth. I've been trying to write this correctly for years now. I'm not sure I have yet. But the canyon is still here. The horses are still exceptional. And that boy with his mother's eyes is learning already to hold his father's hat. I think that's enough. I think that might be everything.